Today we're headed back to the Napoleonic Wars at Aspern. I would get the heck out of there, like, as quickly as possible.
Halting the vital.
I just love these random things coming down the river. Hello everybody, Roger says hey. We're back at the Napoleonic Wars. I'm really enjoying this series on Epic History TV. I had toyed with the thought of going back to Kings and Generals and kind of sitting in Spain for a little bit and going more into those battles, but I think what we're going to do is just finish out Epic History TV and then kind of go back to Kings and Generals and fill in some of those gaps. There's also a lot of naval stuff going on in the Napoleonic Wars that we're not really getting into, so I'm gonna have to go back, maybe find a couple of other channels, fill in a lot of that knowledge. But I'm really excited because I feel like I'm starting to learn a lot more about this era in history, which I've never really done before, at least not in Europe. Over the past week, I have seen a couple of references to this time period in Europe just randomly online, and I actually kind of knew what they were talking about, which, you know, a month or two ago, I would have had no idea. So I'm really loving this historical journey I'm on YouTube, and I'm loving doing it with you guys because you guys teach me a lot of stuff down in the comments. A lot of you really love this part of history and have studied it and know way more than I do. It's just so much more fun doing this with other people that enjoy this as well. Otherwise, I would just be kind of sitting by myself studying this stuff, and I don't know, I feel like I would give up on it a lot easier. So having this YouTube channel to do all of this stuff with other people has really helped me be more motivated to continue learning all of this stuff. And you know that one of the best ways I do that on this channel is from your comments. So what we're going to do is go back to my last video on the Napoleonic Wars. We're going to check out some of your comments there, have a quick little discussion, and then we're going to get into the video reaction for Aspern. Now, if you don't care about this part, you can click on the chapter marker for the reaction and just go straight to that right now. But for the rest of you, let's have a little discussion about Napoleon. Now, of course, the last video that we did was on his blunder in Spain. Now, there was way more to what happened in Spain than what this video went over. Kings and Generals goes more into depth with some of these battles, and I know a lot of you guys have mentioned the Somosierra battle, I believe. May not be saying that quite correctly, but we're going to go back to that stuff, so don't worry about it. I'm not going to just completely skip over it. But let's look at some of what your comments said on this. I do remember towards the end of this video, it did mention that the British and Portugal kind of allied against Napoleon, and I was kind of like, why? And a lot of you in the comments, especially Ben Crowden, sorry, here says, I could be wrong, but I believe the Anglo-Portuguese alliance is the longest continuous alliance in history. It's 1386, so I'm assuming that that is when the alliance started. So I actually had no idea that Britain had that history with Portugal. So good to know moving forward. This video also mentioned that the British army was inexperienced when they went into Spain, and I was like, what? I guess Americans are always told about like how experienced the British army was compared to ours, and so maybe we have an overinflated view of the way that the British army was back then. At least a couple of you kind of mentioned that, but I don't know how accurate that is. I feel like the British army was a pretty well-trained army, but maybe not the troops that they sent into Spain. Princess Lucy Monroe says, though they had a well-trained army, they hadn't had much combat experience aside from the campaigns in Egypt during the War of the Second Coalition and one in Flanders in the War of the First Coalition. So I guess while the British Navy was kind of pretty busy during these times, the army not quite so much. We also haven't really gotten into the Egypt thing. I do remember a few of these videos mentioning Napoleon going to Egypt for a campaign, but I don't really know what he was doing down there. Obviously, he was fighting the British. Canis Rufusuk says, at this period in history, Britain relied mostly on the Royal Navy for defense and to control the seas and international trade, and used blockades, diplomacy, and money for most international relations and conflicts. The colonies were defended on land mostly by local troops due to having large land borders that couldn't be easily protected from invasion. The major continental powers had large conscript armies where large numbers of people would be called up and quickly trained wherever they were needed. Britain not having having to worry so much about invasion, instead went for maintaining a small professional army of very well-trained soldiers, which would mostly be used for raiding and supporting allies rather than staging land campaigns. The geography of Britain made a navy more important than an army. I have a question for you. That idea about supporting allies mostly, from my point of view, that is how I actually see the British military currently. But maybe that is just an extremely biased American viewpoint of things. I know America and Great Britain team up quite a bit for military campaigns. I usually feel like, though, the United States is kind of the leader and we use Britain mostly as support troops, but I could be wrong about that. I might just not know enough about it. You guys let me know, is the role of the British Army still kind of the same as it was back in this time period, or has it changed quite a bit over that time? The flyest one you know, awesome screen name. The Peninsular War was the conflict that bled France dry resource-wise, as you will come to find out later. Okay, well, maybe this video will get into that a little bit more. I'm just getting the sense that Spain was just a really bad decision by Napoleon. Andrew Comerford says Spain and Portugal make up the Iberian Peninsula, hence the Peninsular War, so I was correct about that. I've always heard about the Iberian Peninsula, but embarrassingly, I didn't know what that was referring to, so now I know that's kind of referring to Spain and that area. But why is it called Iberian? Where does that name come from? Visco? VSKO. Quotes me, it's freezing outside, can't imagine what it felt like to march under that much cold. Me sips tea. Yeah, so I'm assuming we're getting to a point where we're going to be learning a little bit more about that as far as Napoleon's army goes. By the way, the snow has all melted finally. Yesterday, the last bit of it, the snow and the ice kind of finally melted because we're back up into more spring-like temperatures. Thankfully, that's over with, but we're still under a boil water advisory because a lot of the water mains around this city froze and then broke. So we're having to boil water if we're going to use it for cooking or brushing our teeth, stuff like that. Hopefully they'll get it fixed soon because we've been doing that for about a week now, and that gets old really fast. Conrad Ward says the biggest mistake Napoleon made in Spain was trying to take it over in the first place. Spain was a French ally and no real threat by this point. Okay, so it was an ally. For some reason I didn't really pick that up. Napoleon turned the Spanish against him just at the point they would have been a useful ally, providing military access to invade Portugal and prevent a British resurgence on the mainland. That's a very interesting point there. Yeah, I just assumed that Spain and France were not allies because Napoleon did invade them and try to take over, so that doesn't make sense to me why he would choose to do that. Maybe you guys can enlighten me a little bit more on what made him make that decision. Alejandro's opinion is better. Spain effectively was Spain's Vietnam. I think he may mean France's Vietnam. The word guerrilla came from this war. Interesting. I didn't know that. It tied down valuable troops that would have been useful for invasions in Austria and Russia. Okay, what is guerrilla referring to then exactly? Zaftra, one of my regular commenters and viewers, says if you watch the program Sharp and Hornblower, you'd be in Spain at that time. I've had so many requests for Sharp and Hornblower, or at least people telling me I should watch it. We're going to get to those two things for sure, but I had no idea that they were set in Spain, so that's kind of cool to know. David Sparks says, this was the start of the war in Spain. My ancestor Richard Roe was in the 2nd Foot Regiment under Wellington and was there in the Battle of Vittoria that kicked the French out of Spain. That's actually really cool, David. It's always fun learning about your ancestors that were involved in like major historical events. Yeah, so I had a question also about the communication lines in this because I was like, well, how are they getting all of this information to Napoleon this quickly, especially when he's like moving around and stuff. Siwi says at this point you had early post systems, which means that instead of one man delivering a message, you would have a relay giving it to the next writer, and after that the next one and the next one and so on. This allowed for relative fast transition of messages, and at least for nobility and important government functions. So I'm guessing one end of the communication line would just always be with Napoleon, and they would have to constantly make those adjustments based on where he was versus where the message or the dispatch was coming from. So I think some of you said that they use boats sometimes, horses, stuff like that to get these messages back and forth. I know here in the States we had something called called the Pony Express back in the day, probably pretty close to this time period. I'm forgetting the exact dates for it, where it was basically just a relay of horses and stations that would deliver mail. So makes sense to me. All right, so I think I'm gonna leave the comments there. Thank you so much once again for sharing your knowledge with me. It does help me learn this stuff a lot faster, so make sure you keep it up. All right, so the video we're about to watch from Epic History TV is called Napoleon Defeated Aspern 1809, so I'm assuming he does not win this battle. Looks to me like there's a bit of a turning point happening where Napoleon was really on a roll in the first few years of the Napoleonic Wars, and now it seems like more and more videos are showing defeats or stalemates of Napoleon. So I don't know if this is going to keep up or not. I don't know if his military is kind of running out of steam at this point, or if he kind of regroups and starts winning battles again. I don't really know what's going to happen. Each one of these videos is a bit of a mystery unfolding for me, especially since I've never really studied any of this before. So let's dive in, and I'm gonna at least find out what happens. I'm sure you already know, so let's go.
History TV History March collaboration, supported by our sponsor Osprey Publishing. In 1809, France under Napoleon Bonaparte was the most powerful nation in Europe. But the French Emperor's invasion of Spain and Portugal the previous year had failed to deliver the easy victory he'd expected. And with many of Napoleon's best troops and commanders now tied down in Spain, an old enemy prepared to challenge France once more.
The court of Vienna is behaving very badly, and they have cause to repent.
Austria had been preparing for war with France since her last humiliating defeat at Austerlitz in 1805. Now, with Napoleon busy in Spain and a British promise of cash subsidies, plus a supporting attack in Northern Europe, it looked like the ideal time to strike.
Okay, so the British are promising subsidies to who? There's an arrow pointing to France here from Great Britain. Yeah, you guys are gonna have to set me straight on this, because I don't understand. Let's go back a little bit.
Napoleon busy in Spain and a British promise of cash subsidies, plus a supporting attack in Northern Europe, it looked like the ideal time to strike.
Okay, I guess the arrow means the attack in Northern Europe. But where are the subsidies going to?
This time, Austria's armies would be led by Archduke Charles, Emperor Francis's younger brother. At 37, he was 2 years younger than Napoleon, but already had 15 years' experience of high command. And he was learning from past defeats. He'd begun to reform the Austrian army along French lines, copying Napoleon's corps system and introducing new infantry tactics.
I have a question about uniforms for all of you who are more like historical military students. Obviously, the camouflage uniforms, I don't think started to really happen until around 1900 or so. When uniforms back in these times were designed, like these for instance that we're looking at right here are white and blue, which obviously, I don't know, maybe if they're fighting in snow or something, that would be sort of like camouflage. But first of all, when exactly did the idea of using camouflage uniforms come into effect? Who was the person or the nation, army, I don't know who it was, that realized, oh, hey, maybe we should make uniforms and make us blend into the environment more? And what dictated what uniforms look like back in these days? Are these like the colors of the country? I don't know. I guess when you're fighting in rows like this, it really doesn't matter because, you're not going to be able to camouflage yourself anyways, so maybe there's not much point to it. So maybe it was when warfare started to kind of go more towards the guerrilla style that we have now, where camouflage uniforms became a thing. I don't know. It's just something I never had thought much about before, so if any of you have knowledge about that, let me know.
In the Napoleonic Wars,
Is this going to be a rehash of... I already did a video on infantry tactics, so this might be a rehash of that, which is fine because I feel like it's good to have a refresher on it.
Infantry fought in close order, packed together, standing shoulder to shoulder. But why present such an easy target for the enemy? First, command and control. Before radios, orders had to be relayed by shouted commands, drums or bugles, difficult enough in the smoke and din of battle. almost impossible if troops were scattered. Second, firepower. Smoothbore muskets were inaccurate beyond about 80 yards, so volley fire, firing en masse, was the best way to inflict physical and psychological
80 yards is not that far. That's crazy. To think you have to be that close to an enemy in order to accurately hit them.
damage on the enemy. Third, morale. Soldiers were much more willing to advance into danger or hold the line if they did so together as a unit, urging each other on. Fourth, defense against cavalry. Scattered infantry were easy targets for horsemen. Only by sticking together could they fight them off. The basic tactical unit of infantry was the battalion. A French line battalion had, in theory, 840 men, but in practice, nearer 500 to 600. Our example here has 605 men, a typical strength for a battalion on campaign. The men were divided into 6 companies, 4 fusilier companies, and 2 flank companies. On the right, the grenadiers, made up of the tallest, strongest men, often detached to form elite all-grenadier units. And on the left, the voltigeurs, specialist light infantry used for skirmishing in front of the battalion.
I'm assuming the terms voltigeurs, fusiliers, grenadiers, or grenadiers, sorry, not grenadiers, are all French terms, maybe, but I'm curious as to what they mean exactly. Like, what's the meaning behind these names? When I think about fusilier, I think about fusing a cannon or something like that, but obviously these troops are just infantry. They're not doing that type of stuff. Yeah, if any of you know how to like interpret those words maybe into English to help me understand more what they mean, I would appreciate it.
Skirmishers moved independently, used cover, and fired at will to harass and unsettle the enemy, while preventing enemy skirmishers carrying out the same task. Most armies also had specialist light infantry units for this role, such as the British 95th Rifles, French Chasseurs à Pied, and Austrian and Prussian Jäger battalions. The traditional battlefield formation was the line, all companies formed up alongside each other, 3 ranks deep. Line formation maximised the number of men who could fire their muskets at the enemy, and limited casualties from artillery fire. But it was extremely vulnerable to cavalry if it could be outflanked. And even for well-drilled troops, it was difficult to keep the line straight while advancing across broken ground. So for manoeuvre and attack, battalions usually formed a column of divisions. This was a more flexible formation that allowed the battalion to advance quickly, though it presented a larger target to enemy guns, firing solid round shot that would tear through several ranks, and far fewer men could fire their muskets at the enemy. Theoretically, therefore, the battalion would deploy into line before reaching the enemy. But carrying out this slow manoeuvre under fire wasn't always possible or sensible. So some commanders kept their men in column, relying on momentum to break the enemy line. This was a risky tactic that often worked against raw troops, but led to high casualties when facing better trained infantry.
Is that the maneuver that Napoleon did against the Russian troops? I feel like I remember that, and I forgot, sorry, what the battle was called. The stalemate one. Was it Friedland? Where they were fighting the Russian troops, and I remember that Napoleon made the decision to kind of go up the middle, just like this. So I'm wondering if that's what kind of led to his defeat.
Like British redcoats. A column could be closed up quickly to provide protection from cavalry, or if there was time, could form a square. With bayonets fixed, the battalion formed an all-round defence that often resembled more of a rectangle. Enemy cavalry could surround the battalion, but not break in, as horses won't charge a solid wall of men and steel. But
I have a question too. Sorry I keep pausing it. The band members, for instance, I'm assuming that the enemy would just try to kill them too, because obviously the troops were listening to the buglers and the drummers for maybe orders and stuff like that. So I'm assuming that they are just as vulnerable as all of the other troops, and the enemy would go and try to kill them just as viciously as they would the soldiers. Did the soldiers have to protect them though? Because I can't imagine having to play an instrument and then also fire a gun or something like that to protect yourself. So so was it the soldiers' jobs, the surrounding them, to protect those guys?
But an infantry square was extremely vulnerable to artillery fire, and could only move very slowly. Changing quickly and smoothly from one formation to another, especially under fire, required training, practice, and experience. In 1809, the Austrian army began to use the battalion mass formation, crude but more suited to hastily trained conscripts. This was a dense column with limited firepower and huge vulnerability to enemy cannon. But it could quickly close up to repel cavalry using the same principle as the square. But
I'm assuming we're going to be seeing this in this video, in this battle. We're going to see formations like this from the Austrians, and I don't know, it's just said that it's really vulnerable to cannon fire, so I would assume that Napoleon would probably try to use a lot of that to try and take them out, but I don't know.
But without the complex drill, and was much more maneuverable. Napoleon, warned by his spies that Austria was preparing for war, left Spain and raced back to Paris, arriving on the 24th of January 1809. The French army in Germany, commanded by Marshal Berthier, would need urgent reinforcement. So Napoleon summoned units from Spain, called up young conscripts, and soldiers from his German allies in the Confederation of the Rhine. La Grande Armée was no longer the finely honed instrument of 1805, but with Napoleon at its head, it was still a formidable force. Archduke Charles...
Okay, so maybe that also played a part in his defeat, as the soldiers weren't as well trained because he's having to call them up kind of at the last minute instead of having them, more trained from France.
At its head, it was still a formidable force. Archduke Charles ordered diversionary attacks in Poland and northern Italy, but launched his main attack against France's ally, Bavaria, on the 10th of April. It came a week earlier than Napoleon had expected and caught the French Emperor by surprise. Charles was relying on a rapid advance, but a last-minute change of plans, torrential rain, and a slow-moving baggage train slowed progress to a crawl. Marshal Berthier was a brilliant chief of staff to Napoleon, but an indecisive field commander. His forces were too widely dispersed, and Marshal Davout's Third Corps was dangerously isolated at Regensburg. Charles ordered his corps to converge and destroy it. But on the 17th of April, Napoleon arrived at Donauwörth to take over command. He immediately ordered Davout to withdraw from his exposed position. It was too late for him to escape without a fight. Davout's Third Corps was one of the best in the Grande Armée, and in a fast-moving battle across wooded hills, the heroes of Auerstadt threw back the Austrians. Despite the heroism of General Major Liechtenstein, badly wounded, leading his troops forward, Third Corps escaped the encirclement. The Battle of Teugn-Hausen was the start of Napoleon's so-called four-day campaign. First, he used Marshal Lefebvre's Bavarian 7th Corps and a provisional corps under Marshal Lannes to drive a wedge into the Austrian army. Then he pursued its left wing towards Landshut, believing he was following the main Austrian army. French troops and their German allies stormed the town's bridge to win a hard-fought victory. But Napoleon realized that Archduke Charles was not at Landshut, and that, once again, he'd left Marshal Davout to face the main enemy force. Sending Marshal Bessières in pursuit of the Austrian left wing, Napoleon swung north, falling on the Austrian 4th Corps at Eckmühl. The French and their German allies...
Why didn't he just go around the back of them and like trap them? Why did he go to the side like that? I don't know. Maybe he didn't know exactly where they were. I don't know. A lot of you guys have told me in past videos that sometimes you just didn't know the exact logistics of everything. But looking at the map like this, it doesn't make any sense. Like it looks like he had free reign to just go behind them and completely encircle the Austrian army there. But
allies won their 4th victory in as... The French and their German allies won their 4th victory in as many days. But Charles's main force was still intact, and hoping to keep it so, he ordered a rapid retreat across the Danube. The French pursued, storming the walled city of Regensburg, which they knew as Ratisbon, with its vital stone bridge. Napoleon put Marshal Lannes in charge of the assault. When the attack faltered, Lannes threatened to lead the next charge in person, and his men, suitably chastised, took the city. During the siege, Napoleon was hit in the foot by a spent bullet, causing widespread alarm, but it proved to be a superficial wound. Stubborn Austrian resistance had allowed Archduke Charles and his army to escape across the Danube. Napoleon had cut the Austrian army in half, but both sections now retreated in good order towards Vienna. Napoleon led his forces in pursuit, detaching Lefebvre's Bavarian Corps to deal with a popular revolt in Tyrol, and 3rd Corps and the Württemberg 8th Corps to guard his line of communications. Charles chose not to defend the capital, which surrendered on the 13th of May after a short bombardment. Instead, Charles and the Austrian army lay in wait across the Danube.
Why did he not defend the capital? That seems like something you would want to do. It's not like Napoleon has a huge army here either. Like, I feel like they would have been able to handle it, but you guys are gonna have to explain that one to me, because I don't understand that decision.
Napoleon was now down to 80,000 men, facing 110,000 Austrians. Charles's army had fought bravely and well throughout the campaign, but Napoleon still had a low opinion of Austrian troops, and decided to attack.
Underestimating your enemy, apparently. To Cannon, all men are equal.
On the night of the 20th of May, French engineers hastily built a series of floating bridges between the river islands of the Danube, and French troops began to cross. By noon the next day, Napoleon had most of Massena's 4th Corps and his cavalry across the river, about 24,000 men and 40 guns, holding the villages of Aspern and Essling. Napoleon expected the Austrians to retreat once more, and that he'd only face a rear guard. But reports soon arrived that the entire Austrian army was advancing against him in 5 attack columns, 90,000 men and 300 cannon. The situation got even worse. The Austrians began to float heavy barges and obstacles downriver to smash through the flimsy French bridge.
Oh, interesting.
Each time, Napoleon's only supply route was cut off for several hours, causing critical delays to the arrival of reinforcements and ammunition.
I've never heard or seen that before, where you would just like let something go downriver and hope it smashes into these temporary bridges. I don't know why I find that kind of funny, but I don't know, it's just a random thing. I've never seen that before. Well, apparently it worked, so...
The battle began around 2:45 p.m. as infantry of the Austrian First Column attacked Aspern.
Yeah, so I see here how they're in those columns, exactly how he was talking about in the tactics portion of the video. So we got that going, but Napoleon doesn't look like he has enough guns, cannons to really attack them very effectively, so...
The village was soon under attack from 3 sides. General Molitor's French garrison clung on desperately, fighting hand-to-hand in the streets, and suffering 50% casualties. To support the defenders of Aspern, Napoleon ordered cavalry to charge the Austrian third column. But they could not break through the Austrian infantry.
Yeah, see, I'm seeing how they're all closed. It said when the cavalry comes, they close in. And I know a lot of you guys have also said, or I've heard in these videos, that horses will not charge like a solid wall like that. So I still feel so bad for these horses. I mean, just looking at this picture, they're just getting shot like point blank. Like, I know horses were probably necessary, but I really hate putting animals like deliberately in harm's way like this. Makes me feel bad for them.
Closed up in their battalion mass formation. At 6 p.m, Archduke Charles ordered General Bellegarde's second column to take Aspern at any cost. Charles himself rode among the front ranks, urging the men forward. In ferocious fighting, the Austrians took the village. Napoleon immediately sent in newly arrived reinforcements to recapture it. About the same time, the Austrian Fourth Column began its attack on the village of Essling, where Marshal Lannes had taken charge of defences while he waited for his own corps to cross the Danube. The first Austrian assault was repulsed. The veteran French cavalry commander General d'Espagne led his cuirassiers in pursuit, but was hit by grape shot and died of his wounds. Around 9 p.m, the Austrian Fifth Column finally arrived in position and made its first attack against Essling, which was thrown back by Lannes' troops. As night fell, firing died out across the battlefield, and men got what rest they could among the dead and the wounded.
I have to admit, though, the French are holding up really well considering the circumstances here. They're way outmanned, but Napoleon is still holding his ground. I don't think he's going to be able to do it that much longer.
Overnight, Second Corps and the Imperial Guard crossed the Danube to reinforce Napoleon's army, which now numbered 71,000 and 150 guns. But then the bridge broke again, leaving Davout's Third Corps still waiting to cross. Nevertheless, Napoleon decided to attack, using Second Corps to break the Austrian centre. But first, Aspern would have to be retaken. Heavy fighting broke out in the village before dawn. By 7 a.m, it was back in French hands.
What do the people that live in these villages do in this situation? Do they just try to flee and go somewhere else, or do they just hunker down in their homes and try to avoid being killed? You know, what the heck goes on with the citizens in these villages? Because I think if I lived in one of these places and I saw armies approaching, I would get the heck out of there, like, as quickly as possible.
At Essling, fresh Austrian attacks were fought off by General Lassalle's cavalry and units of the Young Guard. With both flanks secure, Napoleon launched his main attack in the centre with Lannes' Second Corps. Austrian guns poured fire into the advancing French ranks.
I was gonna say, there are a bunch of cannons right
General
there.
Saint-Hilaire leading the attack, a hero of Austerlitz and Jena, had his foot blown off, a wound that proved fatal. Archduke Charles sent his Grenadier Reserve forward to strengthen the line. The French infantry, under torrential fire, began to fall back. At this critical moment, the French bridge over the Danube was broken again, halting the vital flow of reinforcements.
I just love these random things coming down the river and breaking these bridges over and over and over again. It's comical. Like, it's, I don't know. Just in the context of this video, it's comical to me. Maybe in reality is not so comical, but it's just, oh my gosh. I love it.
Of reinforcements and ammunition to Napoleon's army. By 2 p.m, the French had been driven out of Aspern once more.
Not looking
Heavy
good.
fighting continued in Essling, which was briefly captured by the Austrians, then retaken by the Young Guard. Napoleon knew his army could do no more. At 4 p.m, he ordered his exhausted cavalry to make a last charge to keep the enemy at bay, then gave the order to retreat.
I thought for a second he was doing like some sort of suicidal attack because they were stuck or something, but okay. Like, I get it now, just a distraction while they retreat.
Archduke Charles, whose own army had suffered huge losses and was low on ammunition, was content to watch the French withdraw to the island of Lobau. In the final moments of the battle, Marshal Lannes, one of Napoleon's finest commanders and closest friends, was hit by a cannonball that smashed both his legs. He died of his wounds a week later. It was a deep blow to the Emperor.
I don't know anything about Marshal Lannes, but I have heard his name a lot in these videos, so I understand how important he was to Napoleon, because he's been everywhere, basically commanding at this point. What a loss for France and for me.
The two-day Battle of Aspern-Essling was Napoleon's first major defeat, caused by his overconfidence and hasty planning. Both sides suffered heavy losses, and Napoleon avoided a much greater disaster.
French dead are 7,000, wounded 16,000. Allied dead 4,290. Allied wounded about the same. Yeah, there were a lot more Napoleon's troops that died, not quite twice as much.
Only because of the exhaustion of the Austrian army. The French Emperor had learned new respect for the Austrians. Under Archduke Charles, they had fought bravely, with greater confidence, organization, and leadership. Within days of his defeat, Napoleon had summoned reinforcements to join him on the Danube, and begun planning his revenge.
Alright, so there we have Napoleon's defeat at Aspern. I actually really enjoyed that video. It was a lot more dramatic than some of the other ones that we've seen before. Loved the bridge breaking going down the river. I would actually like to see that in action. It's also fun because as these videos go along and I see how the troops are moving kind of in lines and so forth, I'm seeing some of the different tactics and the strategies playing out that I have learned, especially in the tactics portion of these videos. I'm starting to see things repeat more and more and starting to get a better idea for what like war strategy was like back then. It really is like a chess match almost. That's what makes it so interesting, is you're trying to kind of outmaneuver your enemy. It's like watching sports almost in a lot of ways. And I think that that's what makes it so intriguing. I enjoy watching sports and watching the different strategies and trying to outmaneuver your opponent. And so I think that that is one reason why I actually enjoy learning about like military strategy, because I actually play sports and how to learn plays and different strategies, you know, against our opponents. And so I think I have a bit of a connection with military strategy in that way. So anyway, really looking forward to the next few videos in this series. We're going to see if this defeat of Napoleon kind of carries on into the future battles, or like I said, if he regroups and kind of gets his military, his army back together again. It's also interesting learning about these other armies like the Austrians and the Prussians, the Russians, the Spanish, the Portuguese. You know, my exposure to European military is primarily through the eyes of like World War II, which has very different kind of armies than what we're seeing here. It kind of makes me wonder about armies like the Austrian army, what happened to them, because you don't really hear about them in the modern era. So I guess over time, empires rise and fall. I don't know the history of it, but I'm going to learn it. I'm getting to that point. So we got more of the Napoleon War series. We're going to finish out Epic History TV. We're going to get to Napoleon's marshals and then do some other stuff on other channels, like I said, to fill in the gaps with some of the naval stuff, and maybe go back to Spain and visit some of those battles there again. If you can answer any of my questions below in the comments, or if you want to add to the discussion, please do so. Also, if you enjoyed this video, make sure that you like and subscribe. We got a lot more content like this coming your way. My next video is actually going to be getting back to some of the UK stuff. If you're more interested in just like me learning about the UK, then you'll definitely want to tune in for the next video. And I'm also going to be getting to the Indian space program, because I would like to start getting into some space videos. All of that coming up soon, so stay tuned, and Roger and I will see you next time.